I'd like to wind back in time to when, before you were involved in the markets and you got your first inkling of that might be a subject that you'd be interested in. How did that initial interest start, and where did it come from?
I've always been interested in markets. I don't know why. I've had this bent for economics since I was about 12. And whilst other kids were collecting football cards and stuff, which I did a bit of and played marbles, I was also looking at newspapers with the economic news, right? Nerdish, I don't know. But that's what happened. Plus, I was in what I think now was a lucky position. I didn't think so at the time. My father, being in business, he was a pretty tough man in a way, and he believed that kids needed to be seen and not heard. So when he came home from work running a business, he employed about 300 people. So I know now how stressful that can be. He'd come home and dinner would be on the table, and then for the next hour whilst we had dinner, him and Mum would talk, and we had to shut up. Right? Couldn't say anything. Couldn't we do our best to hide the Brussels sprouts and the peas and everything else because we didn't want to eat them. But I know now I ended up getting, that hour of business education, right? My father would complain long and loud about the then Labor government because he said the inflation that we had, this is early 70s, was all the Labor government's fault and everything else. And I just pigeonholed myself and thought, one day I've got to check that out, whether that's actually the case. And so I did economics at school, and then I was always interested in stock market just because, when I was looking at prices when I was 17, 18, when I was looking at the prices of some of the stocks, I could see that one day the share price might be, say, $1. The next day it might be $1.10 or $1.20, or next week. And I thought to myself, if I could buy it at $1 and I could sell the next day at $1.10, I wouldn't have to work. This would be fantastic. I could get rich. As I found out, it's not quite that simple because emotions get in your way. And I don't know how many times I've bought at $1.10 and sold at $1, right? The exact opposite of what you're trying to do. But anyway, you live and learn. And that intrigued me as to why I would get caught like that. It intrigued me why one day a stock was worth $10 and the next day it was worth 12. What was going on here? So I took my economics degree. I did accounting as well, worked out how earnings work and forward earnings and stats and various things. And went from there. That's sort of how I started and what I got on. That's my interest. I'm always interested in those sort of things. Plus, I've always been interested in crowd behaviour. My sister, bless her, was always interested. The first thing she was interested in was David Cassidy, and then it was the Bay City Rollers. And for the life of me, I just couldn't understand this crowd behaviour about how just girls and guys for different reasons went nuts over a particular person or this behaviour. Right? When the Bay City Rollers hit, it was just astonishing. And then you see in finance, it seemed the same thing, right? In the 90s, it was internet stocks, and now we've got crypto. People just go nuts and get into this fad, right? I've always been interested in trying to explain that a little bit.
So would you say that you were more of an observer when you were at school and you were kind of watching how other people operated and sort of learning from that? Because I don't think that's something that you can be necessarily taught. You're kind of naturally interested in why people make decisions, because I'm the same. I'm interested in that, and I've followed a similar path, not the business. My father didn't have a business that I'd listen to, but I was always kind of interested in the way the markets work. I would write down share prices by hand. I would read what the newspaper said should happen, and then I'd look at what would happen next. And I found that there was no correlation between what they were saying, and I realized that was not going to work. So I started using technical analysis because I was trading with a friend, and we took some very big positions and just sort of hoped that they went up. And that was not a strategy. And it was a good education. It cost me quite a lot of money. But I think that rings true for people, doesn't it, who've gone through the process of learning. If you haven't had those losses, you wouldn't really appreciate what good education is. And
well, right, the way to make $1 million in the stock market is to start with 2 million, right? So, yeah, that's just what happens. But crowd behaviour, it's a funny thing. I went back and studied it. I looked at the Beatles and that phenomena and various things. The 3 things that really interested me was the Beatles crowd and what happened, and also the rise of Adolf Hitler, how he got to power, not necessarily the man himself, and the JFK thing as well. So I've always looked at that sort of thing, right? See what happens. And I did find just on that topic, when you talk about the Beatles, the phenomenon of Taylor Swift, I think, is similar. Happened around the same time when in 1963 we had the threat of nuclear war. We had the Profumo affair here. Newspapers at the time, I'm sure they picked up that the public was sick and tired of all the negative news, needed a break, a circuit breaker, and that was the Beatles that come along. The Beatles themselves, they often say they could never understand why they got into the media and why they made such a big thing of right from the very start. But it seemed to me that they were there at the right time, the right product that the newspapers needed to put on the front pages to take people's attention away from all the dastardly stuff that was happening. Taylor Swift the same. We had all the phenomenon of what's happening in the Middle East and all the stuff that was going on before about COVID and everything else. I think the newspapers worked out that to sell more papers, they needed a different phenomenon. And there she was. So then it goes from there. But that's what I found. And I also found over the years when I was studying these sort of things, this sort of thing only happened at certain times. And that's really what I've learned. And if you can work out what happens at certain times, then you've got a great assistance in markets.
Well, that's a really interesting observation. That's something that I think I didn't study history at school, apart from what I was forced to study, and I found it really boring. And now I kind of look back and I really regret not understanding history. And if you look back, you can connect everything to the markets. The markets are so important. So I wish I'd done more work on history. But understanding cycles obviously is of key importance, but we'll get to that in just a moment because you're the world expert on cycles, and I think that would be a very fair assessment of the work that you've done. But before we get to that, let's just take a step back. You were interested in business. You learned a lot by listening to your father. You watched a business develop. You knew it was something that you wanted to be involved with. What happened next?
When I was doing economics at school and then at university, the professors and the teachers, the more I got into it, the more I realised that they didn't know what they were doing. They could not explain. They had all these theories. They had all these stuff that they were teaching, just the economic stuff, not the statistics and everything else. The mathematical side of things, that was fine. But what they were the way they were trying to explain what was happening in the outside world was a farce. I went through university when we had high unemployment. It was, in Australia, especially down in Melbourne, it was up around 12%, which I think was pretty much worldwide through the 1980s. That was the whole Margaret Thatcher phenomenon, the unions and the coal mines and everything else. It was hard to find a job. Different to today, chalk and cheese. But back then it really was, things were on the down. And not only did we have high unemployment, but we had high inflation figures. I mean, I bought my first house in Australia. I was paying 17.5% interest rate. It's unfathomable now. If I explain that to anybody now, it's beyond belief. How could you possibly pay that amount of interest? Yes. So I said to myself, I resolved, because I did my university degree part-time. So I was doing night school. So I was working during the day and doing that at night, which I'm happy I did it that way. I resolved when I'd finished and I'd sign out of work. I'd sign off from school if I didn't get any answers, and I'd go around the world. So in 1985, I think it was, cashed in all my money. Get these, I bought traveller's checks, right? I remember those. You put them in a pouch. You try and explain that to people these days. Again, it's just so different. When you meet people so when I was meeting people overseas, you'd have to swap your address or you'd swap your fax number, right? If somebody had one. Anyway, those days are gone, thank heavens. So I just resolved I wasn't going to come home until I had made some sort of connection in trying to explain economics and the way things behaved and why things happened. Not only just why things happened as they did, but why things happened when. That was my major pulling point for me. I just needed, why does this happen now and why didn't it happen back then? All the connections, right? So I did. I got a job in Switzerland and I then for a few months, and then after that, I just decided I had this crazy idea that I'd decide I'd go back to Australia, but not flying. So I had to get train, walk, whatever it was, bus, and whatever have you. And so I ended up going right through Russia at the time from Finland. That was before the wall came down. Well, that was an education, I tell you. Then into Mongolia and in China, through into Tibet when it was just open, around into Kathmandu, around Mount Everest, and then back basically to Australia. But it was in India. When I went through India, I had this awakening of some sort, whereby it occurred to me that it's to do with the land. It's all, at the end of the day, economics is a land question. And once that dawned on me, which I'm forever grateful, it became much easier to unravel the mystery of the market and how economics works.
Do you remember that actual moment where it was a sudden epiphany? It might have been like the way Henry George had that sudden epiphany.
Yeah, well, I was in New Delhi, and I was staying in a sort of like not a youth. You could describing it as a youth hostel was somewhat ambitious. So I had to race down the stairs. It's 47 degrees already in New Delhi in August. It was pretty hot, and I wanted to get there early to the bank, because in those days with banks and the way they work, you have to get yourself into the bank, show who you are, cash your travels check. It could take hours, especially in India. So I tried to get there early. I was rushing out of the hostel. This is in the middle of New Delhi, and I ran straight into the back of an elephant, and I just got a hell of a shock. And that put me in the gutter of the street. And I was next to a guy that was pretty emaciated as a beggar, right? But for shade, he was sitting underneath a cartload of just fantastic fruit. And then it occurred to me what I was sitting on was just a land question. It just came to me as just sort of just out of the blue. I was very lucky. And it all went from there, really. It was just that moment. And when I pigeonhole it, but have my travels. When I go back to Australia, I came back a bit angry, and I joined a middle-of-the-road, non-mainstream political party, and decided that I'd get into politics and change things to work out telling everybody what I'd found, which was the dumbest move I ever made, because I learned pretty quick that's a corrupt system, or at least the people get corrupted. They're not corrupt when they go in, but they get corrupted. And whilst doing that process, there was a group called the Henry George League that sent me this brochure. It was a Winston Churchill speech. And would you believe it? I used to think Winston Churchill was a extreme right-wing fascist, really, because he was in the Tory party, and that's not my scene. But I found out that Winston Churchill, who is a beloved figure here, he was an exponent of what they called the land question. In other words, he came into Parliament advocating a change in the tax system and move taxes more to land rather than on individuals and businesses. I was astounded. I couldn't believe it. So then it was sent to me by this very obscure Henry George Club, who I'd never heard of, but they'd been around a long time. And I went into the library there and I started reading, and I just felt I'd come home. I felt I'd been there before. And it clicked. You can see that I discovered that the whole land thing, that it's been completely written out of economics. And so economists particularly, they'll never have any hope of explaining the system. And people who listen to them will never have any hope of understanding what things are about, because the whole role of land has been deliberately written out of economics. And so it all progressed from there, really. And then I was lucky enough to be thrown a book written by Fred Harrison called The Power in the Land.
When did you read that?
I was reading that, would have been 1991, right? And yeah. Fred Harrison had written a book in 1983 forecasting the crash in after 1989 for a bottom in the markets in 1991. How good was that, me reading the book, right? I'd always wanted to learn how to forecast economics, and Fred had done some of the work for me about the UK market. That was a revelation as well. That proved to me that you can forecast, and you can forecast accurately, at least on a real estate cycle basis. From there, I was lucky enough to have been handed some books on W.T. Gann, who then had what he called this financial timetable, which purported to show how over a course of 18 to 19 years, how the Dow and US markets would move every year within that 18.6 year cycle. I mean, that was just mind bending at the time. I didn't understand it completely, but it was just who'd believe? Could you possibly believe that in certain years the Dow's going to do certain things? Some years it'll be up, some years it'll be down, and you can basically forecast that in advance. So it's unbelievable.
But the connection was your connection with the real estate cycle. He hadn't made that connection.
Yes, that's right. So I came to stock markets and to Gann through real estate and through the cycle. And I'm lucky I did, because I was immediately able to see that Gann's financial timetable had a lot to do with the real estate cycle. Gann didn't connect it that way, but I could see it. And it just became even easier to interpret. And then I realized, this was the early 1990s, then I realized that I had the nuts and bolts of a business here that I could build. Because Fred Harrison had studied the UK markets. I realized that I could study the US market, which for me was where I thought the money was. And I could build a business out of that, because I was, by that stage, working in the family business. It was good, but I just didn't think I was the sort of person that could work with mum and dad. And I'm probably not employable. So I thought, why not do my own stuff? And I'm eternally grateful I did. And I managed to build my own subscription business, but even more so, it gave me the time to trade markets and understand them even more from a time perspective rather than just the price. And, we built from there. And along the way, I've been able to, when I give talks and various things, I've been able to meet some tremendous people along the way who in turn have done work and study and also been into Gann. And we've been able to swap notes and talk and do various things. And I found it very rewarding. So I'm very grateful. That's been tremendous.
So you talk about economics being corrupted. From the same sort of perspective, I worked in an investment bank in the early part of my career, having learned technical analysis, and I was absolutely shocked at how the economists didn't seem to really understand how the markets worked. But moreover, seemed unwilling to learn even when they didn't really understand it. So something major would happen that would catch them out, like a big move in the dollar that they'd been predicting the other way, and they never seemed to change their opinions. And it was mainly because they were being paid to give their opinions, and that it didn't really seem to matter because there was no money on it. Whereas the traders I associated much better with, because we were trying to get the markets right. So it seemed like there was two different things going on. I also studied economics, and I found that it clearly didn't work, or it obviously didn't work for me. And I always wondered why it was that. Through Mason Gaffney's work, we now realize that there's actually so much more to this story that's absolutely incredible.
Yes. Well, it's a funny thing, this basis about the whole forecasting bit, when so many people don't try to work out further from there, and the whole again talk about Mason Gaffney. He wrote a book, The Corruption of Economics, and he shows how the whole land question was written out, and then it dawns on you that it's not really at the end of the day an economic question, it's a political question. And the ownership of the land, which confers on you the right to collect the rent, is a remarkable political power. And so when you start to get into that, then you start to get into what should be called political economy. That's really what economics is. And you start to see where the power base lays. And then it dawns on you, well, it's no wonder it's been written out, because, and this for me is a genuine conspiracy. I think it's the only conspiracy that really is a conspiracy. All the rest are just imaginations of what people are thinking about. But this one really does have some legs, whereby the American universities, they did not want to teach the three factors of production, land, labour and capital. They needed to show that there's only two, and land became capital. And that's how you can confuse everybody. once you extrapolate, once you bring out the land and you start studying how much rent there is around the world, you realize why it's not taught to you, because they don't want, when I say they, the people who are collecting it en masse, and this is the newspaper proprietors and the girls and guys that sit in the House of Lords here, where you can see it more, and of course the seriously rich that own a lot of land. They don't want us to know just how easy it is to start collecting the rent. And so once I saw the political question, then I thought, well, okay, you can time this. So that's where my business started. That's where it ran. And I started teaching people not only the earnings of land and what it means, but how you can use that cycle for your own investment purposes. And so that's when it started to get interesting for me. And, you know, the whole thing about the ownership of land, if you start putting land back into the equation with economics, then it becomes obvious that if you want to solve some of the problems around the world, well, you stop taxing workers and stop taxing businesses and start raising the revenue from the land under a leasehold system, for example, which is precisely how the House of Lords works. And they're not going to ever want that. So it's a political question rather than economic. And, you know, you go from there about how easy it is to see. For me, I wasn't always out to try and change things, but I did find that once I start in my classes and talking to people when I run my sessions, I started showing people what the earnings of land is and how significant it is. And I started to see that some people sit in the audience, they'd have their own moment. I could see it in their eyes, or I could see their mouth falls. Or, you know, there's a complete immediate change of behaviour. And then they start connecting the dots, and then they begin to realise, I can use that. I can see where that's leading. And if, you know, when Phil's explaining some of this stuff, that there's money there. I can see what's going on. And the biggest common question, the biggest refrain I get after people that have been with me for a little while, they write in and say, the first thing practically everybody says is, Phil, I wish I'd met you years ago. Now it's just the common refrain, because now they see it. Yes, it's just a dawning, right? We have a phrase for that, which we call, you know, people who've studied the land market, they call it seeing the cat, right? So I don't know why it's got all to do with that, but it's just a revelation that comes to you, and it really is a revelation. And then then you can just take it from there, and it's just your investment career and what you're doing in the markets just becomes so much easier. So the second thing people always say to me is, once they say, well, I wish I'd met you before, the second thing they usually say to me is how much of a relief it is now to understand the system and then be able to put it to far better use and not worry about all the day-to-day noise that happens in all the newspapers, because they can see it for what it is, a daily drama, but it doesn't affect the real estate cycle and the other cycles. So I get an immediate, that's great for me to be able to let people say that.
You have a project called the Citizens Dividend where you discuss this. Now, I must admit, when I first met you, I didn't fully get the implications of what this is, and I now understand it. Throughout
it's big, right?
It's big. The point that I think most people will come at this as is some people who've worked very, very hard throughout their career, they've saved up, they bought their house, and they feel like that they deserve that because they've chosen an area and whatever it might be. To then say that actually we should give up the land for the good of everybody, they're not going to really want to go along with that. But when we understand that you would have no other taxes whatsoever, it sounds like a communist plan when you first talk about it. But actually, when you think about it, it's an equitable system where everybody gets to share in the natural resources of the world, and it's shared equitably among everybody, but there are no other taxes. So that means businesses could absolutely flourish. You could live a much happier life, and you wouldn't get this concentration. You could still create a business in whatever you want and still be really successful. It's not saying that you need to give the profits for everything that you've created. In fact, quite the opposite. It's just saying, you look at your business, look at whatever you're working on. You will no longer pay any tax at all if the land rent was shared into the public purse?
I do, when I talk to my people in the classes and various things, to try and get them to see the system so they can exploit it better for themselves. I teach them about a citizen's dividend, because I know at the end of the day, if you can get that, then it absolutely 100% makes you a far better investor, because you see through the system and you see the whole land operation. So I sort of explain it by suggesting that it's like the what here is called the Crown Estate. Back in 1600 and something, I think it was King George, like so many people, he'd run up a lot of debts and he couldn't pay them back. So he went to the Exchequer and he said, listen, I will give you my rights to future rent if you pay me a stipend. And so the Exchequer ran with that. And so the king, on everything he owned, which is basically these days around a bit of Mayfair, Regent Street, and a bit beyond, and Green Park, and just all around there. The rent that is earned from the land, but not the buildings, that is put separately into a fund called the Crown Estate. That money then is given to the Exchequer. So it's about 300 million a year, and that means that it's 300 million that the government doesn't have to raise from taxes elsewhere, you and me. In return for the government receiving that 300 million, the king gets back about 40 million for his expenses. Now, that the king and the Duke of Cornwall and others, they own a lot of other real estate. But just for this, what's called the Crown Estate, that those funds are given to the government, and then the king gets this stipend back of about 40 million. And I'm sure he's worth it in that sense, because it provides enormous to keep the upkeep of the buildings and to do what he does. It's brings in an awful lot of tourism revenue, and the buildings that have been created on the Crown Estate, beautiful buildings, wonderful to see, right? So we give him the 40 million or so. All I'm suggesting is I would expand that system to the whole of the United Kingdom. Whilst we expand that system, so the government would collect its money solely from the rents paid on land. In return, no other taxes. Not only there no other taxes, but there'd be nothing at all. No VAT, no taxes on cigarettes, no drinking, nothing. No other taxes. No, I don't know the situation here, but in Australia there's 150 other taxes. Get rid of them all. Now this has some astounding ramifications. What it means is, and I think this is why the system will never be put into place. What it means is the government, the ruling government, would not have any need to know anything about you at all, except for how much land you own. Now, going back to the Crown Estate, the Crown owns the land. It has title. So it's absolutely got nothing to do with being communist. You own the land. Everybody else would continue, whoever the landowner is. But in return for safe passage, in return for rights to do what you want on that land, you have to give back to the Commonwealth or to the fund. You have to give back what that land earns. And basically it's going to be about 5% of the price. And eventually, if you're taking the earnings of that land value, eventually over time, the land price comes down to zero. Now, I say to all my people when I'm in classes, if you can imagine living in a system where the land price is zero, then you've understood what it's all about. And I guarantee you, if you can understand that, you will become a much, much better investor, which is what I try to show people. And so can you imagine living somewhere where nobody, the government especially, doesn't collect any information about you? It doesn't need to know your bank accounts. It doesn't need to know your phone numbers. It doesn't need to know anything at all. And in fact, if you extrapolate that to its logical conclusion, you could run without a government. Seriously. And when I explain this to people in classes, they don't get it first. But you really could. We don't need government to function in a society. So what would be happening would be the people paying the land rent, the owners of the land paying that land rent to, say, a sovereign wealth fund collected. And in return, if there's a surplus, and of course there would be, when every year, at the end of every year, the surplus that's collected would be paid back to every single citizen as a citizen's dividend. So not only would you be functioning in a society where you've got no taxes, no government burden, nobody asking you for information. At the end of every year, you would get the sovereign wealth fund or the limited government that we might have is going to give you a check for several $1,000s, every individual from the time you are born and registered for the rest of your life. Now, think about what that could do. So by the time you get 20, you might have quite a number of thousands of dollars, every man, woman and child, to do with what you wanted. So if you thought that you wanted to do nothing for 12 months and just sit on a street corner, you can do that. If you just wanted to think about the world, if you wanted to think what you're going to create, something you wanted to do, paint, art, pottery, whatever it is, you've now got the ability to do this. Now, people often come back to me and say, I feel that could never work. But of course it does, because this is what the Duke of Westminster and all the people sitting in the House of Lords, this is what they do. They are the landlord. At the moment, they collect the rent. I think it should go to some sort of communal fund. There are 3 places in the world that do this now. The first place is Norway. Norway collects the rent of its oil, and there is so much money that they collect. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund now owns 2.5% of every single stock listed in every place in the world, on average. It's also done in Alaska, a part of the United States, would you believe? And it was a Republican governor that set this system up. The oil in Alaska, for want of a better word, you'd call it the profits, but it's not profit, it's the rent, it's the surplus. It's the surplus that is created when oil is discovered. And there's a lot of it, that surplus. That after the oil companies do their productive effort and get the oil out, there is a rent left over. The Alaskan government levies a charge on that rent, which is paid to a sovereign wealth fund in Alaska. Every single year, from the time an Alaskan person is born, they're paid on average at the moment $1,500 US. So for a family of 4, every year in Alaska, that family of 4, will get $6,000 every single year. This is also done in Singapore. In Singapore, you have to lease the land from the government. You can't actually own it yourself. In return, and nobody would argue that Singapore is a communist country. It isn't. It's one of the most best places to live in the world. There's no crime there. That's because basically the people like their government, because the government collects the rent, but it goes into a sovereign wealth fund, which is smart, which means the politicians can't fiddle with it and can't steal it. And so the sovereign wealth fund in Singapore, now after just 45 years of operation, is now one of the most wealthy funds in the world. They own a lot of stocks, and when necessary, so during COVID, when it was necessary, the Singapore government said, well, people are struggling a little bit here. We'll have the sovereign wealth fund pay to all of our Singapore citizens $500 to help them over the costs of COVID. So, and it's why this system isn't more widely seen. And once you see the benefits of it, I just find it astounding. But I don't go down that track in everything I do for my subscribers and my investors. I just simply show them how the system works. And once they get it like that, I know from all the feedback I get, just makes them a far better investor. Once you can see and understand that if you can cope with a swap of the tax base away from labour and away from capital onto land, and then when you do that, the land prices then can have land price will be zero. You become a much better investor.
Have you ever thought about going, I know you had a foray into politics and you decided it wasn't for you, and I completely understand why you wouldn't want to do that, but anybody who would go forward with this kind of plan to say, effectively, we could get rid of all taxes and everyone could benefit, would you ever think about having another go?
No, I don't think so, because I think the body politic now has been so completely corrupted that I'd never get to where I wanted to go, because I'd be eliminated probably. There is so much money involved here. I've done back of the envelope calculations. So if, from a world point of view, if you added in the Saudi Aramco, if you added the world's richest and largest oil company, if you added in the oil rent that they generate, if you added in all the oil rents that are generated around the world, if you then added up what the total value of land is around the world, and then levied a 5% land value capture rate on all of that, every single citizen in the world would probably be able to get a check once a year of $10,000 US every single year. Now, of course, I am talking a little bit utopian there. The collection mechanism and, the introduction of it, you couldn't do it around the world. It's got to be done locally and everything else. So leaving all that stuff aside, there is so much rent in the world, so much economic rent, that the whole amount of it is astounding. And the other thing that I often have a look at is what I'm espousing here would actually work, and that's why it will never be introduced, because it would work, and it just would not be amenable to the 1% of the world that owns most of the largely valuable land in various places. Which, when you think about it, this is, I think, at the moment, what's driving Elon Musk and Virgin and other companies to start chasing asteroids, because the trillions of value of the minerals in the asteroids. And when they discover that and work out a way how to get it and how to mine it, they're then going to need the US military to protect that investment, right? And there you have it. That's what happens in the world today. And we're going to export that system into space instead of saying, hey, that value that's on the asteroid, we could all celebrate that. And if we took half that value and gave it to everybody in the world, none of us would have to work. We'd sit back and just live a life of Riley, really. But it's not going to happen.
I always thought that if you could get this information in front of a politician, they would listen and they would learn, especially the fact that in the markets crash on a regular basis, yet the economic models, when they do crash, say that the chances of a crash are 1 in, 20,000 years or whatever, yet we've seen so many happen. And then I read in Boom Bust how Fred Harrison, and indeed yourself, had sat in a room with, and this is utterly shocking, that you sat in a room with members of the Bank of England and senior politicians, Gordon Brown, telling them literally when the market was going to crash in 2007, one of the most, there was many people looking at markets technically who could see that there was a problem and it was going to resolve in a big crash. But this is something else. Actually telling the politicians the arrogance that they have. I wondered whether it was arrogance or whether they just didn't want to know for the reasons that maybe you've just outlined.
Yeah, that was a vivid day for me. It was December 13, 2006. And I was there with Fred because, I hadn't known Fred that long by that stage. So it was really, I was a bit overawed being able to be there with Fred and all the stuff that, we'd done a bit of stuff together and various things. And I was sitting, and when we walked in, we'd been there all day and we were on last. I just expected that we'd get a few questions and people would have a look at it and take it a bit more seriously. But, Fred got halfway through his presentation and the economists, they started laughing. And, I stood up and ran the back and I said, stop laughing. This is going to happen. I said, there's very good grounds for this taking place because Fred studies the land value, in the land price independently. You guys don't do this. You've got no idea what this is all about. But they weren't listening. One of the problems from what I face in connection with that, what Fred faces is the same. When I stand up and make a forecast and say to people, this is what I think is going to happen, to them, I just sound like another prognosticator, another forecaster, right? And they're a dime a dozen and they've seen it all and they've done a lot of reading and basically most people don't come out. And for people who haven't heard me that much, they don't know I'll say theoretical background, but they don't know the background we've got in having studied the land question, which is now not in economics anymore. They don't see all that background. So they don't have a basis upon which to judge how we're doing things a little bit differently. But, Paul, you've been in some of our classes and you've been here behind that. Once it dawns on you, right, you can't look at things the same way anymore. And so people who end up taking a bit of time to study it, you then can see that you have a very good economic model in which to make the basis of a few forecasts which have a reasonable chance of coming out, because at the end of the day, it is based on a very good science, and the science is earnings. And so Homer Hoyt, who wrote 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago, Roy Wexley, who was probably the first economist that first forecaster really in the United States in the 1930s. Both of them showed how the cycle turned on earnings, land earnings. And there's nothing mystical or esoteric about that. It's statistically and science-based. It's accounting-based. It's just the earnings. And there'll come a time when people in a system that we've built today where the land grant is enclosed and traded as a price and then used by banks as collateral, there'll come a time when the earnings of that land simply goes too high for ordinary mortals like you and me and for other businesses to afford. And when the land price goes too high and it's hard to afford, the government steps in and say, well, how can we solve this problem? So they start giving handouts to people and they start promising, $25,000 grants to first home buyers. The banks then get creative and think about how can we start creating a system of where it's easier to get a loan. So they'll then start saying, well, perhaps we should have a 30-year mortgage instead of a 25-year mortgage or even a 50-year mortgage. Or that shortly they'll start discussing how a mortgage can be handed over to your kids. All that, as we know, once you understand the land system, all of that gets capitalised into the price. All that does is make land price even higher. And so there'll come a time regularly, and we are at that time now, where the land price is just simply too high. And if you look around, you can see that it's too high by all the people sleeping in tents around Goode Street Station and all the other places where they are, right? Because they can't afford their own place. So they are what an economist or what David Ricardo would say, they're sleeping on the margin, which is the footpath, which is free. And so all the signs now are pointing where we are, what I study, the real estate cycle, it's all pointing to the fact that we're in that stage now where the land price is too high. People know the land price is too high, but they don't know why it's too high, and they don't know how to fix it. And all they get is more crap from government to say, well, or the Federal Reserve or the central bank here. They get more of this stuff to say now. The federal bank, the bankers come out and say, well, we've got it handled. We'll know what's going on. We put interest rates up a little bit to stop the inflation. Then when they need to go down, we'll put them down a little bit and we'll fix stuff and blah, blah, blah. Government steps up and says, well, we've got this handled as well and blah, blah. And right now, people have had enough, as you can see. And so they start looking to other different sort of politicians, a guy like Donald Trump or a guy like Nigel Farage, populists who start to say, well, the other guys haven't got the answer. Here's what I think we should do. Vote for me. And of course, in the long run, history shows that those guys are going to be even worse because they're just out for themselves. So things get to the state where it's a bit grim. And here we are, just simply because people don't understand what land is.
Funnily enough, on the way here, I bumped into a lady who was handing out leaflets for a property company. So I got into a chat with her about it, and she was saying, oh, I wish I'd bought property in the 2000s. And I said, well, did you know what interest rates were around that time? You know, they were probably just coming down from double digits. Yeah. And I remember when interest rates were at 15%, a friend of mine's mum bought a house and she was saying, I've got to lock in my rate. It's only 10%, which is laughable now that they would that would be a low level. But the point is that from her perspective, it's always been unobtainable. And what you're saying here is that it becomes more and more unobtainable, and the government then step in and try and fix the problem. And then everything concentrates like a black hole into one area. And then eventually the system can't take it. And this happens on a regular basis. And we're heading towards that. And the fact that she's working for a company trying to get people to buy property and deal with it
tells you all you need to know.
It absolutely tells you all you need to know at this point. If the signs are all there if you look out for them. Yeah. One of the signs in 2006, I remember there was a guy shouting in Starbucks very loudly, very obnoxiously, about his property portfolio and how well he was doing. And I thought, that is a sign.
Yeah. Yes. So that's what I do. That's what I do for people. I try to show them that the whole system has a regular cycle, which a lot of people have a hard time believing. But I try to show them the regular cycle, and then I show them the steps along the way that they can identify that tells them where they are in the cycle. Perhaps my claim to fame is that I've been able to marry the stock market to the real estate cycle and real estate property to the stock market. Most people do one or the other. They're either property investors or they do the stock market, one or the other. But I can show how that works both together. And then when people combine those things, you can start reading the stock market as well to say where you are in the real estate cycle. And then if you know the history, it really doesn't then prove too difficult for anybody who knows the system and the history to then start saying to themselves, well, I think it's pretty obvious what's going to happen next. So and from here, land price can't keep coming up forever. We're going to probably get big, huge, tall building announced again like they are doing, which is telling you land price is too high. Somebody might stand up, probably won't be here, might be in the US, might be in Dubai. Somebody will stand up and say, well, property prices never collapse. You better get in now. And, when you look back, I can't blame the average punter for getting frustrated with house prices. We have had COVID, house prices kept going up. We've had interest rate rises, they've basically doubled. House prices kept going up. I said they would. Most people said they wouldn't. And so you get to the stage now where people can say to themselves, well, I don't have a house, or if I do, I've got to get another one. I've been waiting for years for property prices to come down. They've never come down. I've got to get in. And so interest rates move down a little bit from here. The fear of missing out. That's basically the last year and a half, 2 years of the real estate cycle, because it just brings everybody in. And so when governments start announcing schemes to get particularly first home buyers in, because they're at the bottom of the scale, and pushing more people in at the bottom allows everybody to move up, they'll be coming in at precisely the wrong time. So they'll be high in debt, high house prices, which is just land price. And eventually when things do turn down, as they do at regular cyclical basis, we're going to have a lot of angry people.
Your business partner, Akhil Patel, came on our podcast during COVID, and it was the astonishing call that he made that house prices wouldn't go down that was the first sort of step, that this is something special. That you guys are onto something special. To say that house prices would go down at that point was a major, major call.
They wouldn't go down.
That they wouldn't go down.
Yes.
And the fact that they bounced back up so quickly was absolutely incredible. So Akhil's consistently said that 2026 is the year that we need to look out for the signs that the property market, the land market, is going to peak. And that fits in with your overall roadmap of where things are going.
Well, I've been saying that for, almost 2 decades, since 2008, 2009. And it's in print. It was in Money Week twice on the cover about the call, about how things would recover, and they kept going up till 2026 roughly. And here we are approaching that sort of year. More important though, what I do for my readers and my subscribers, I show them how to work out for themselves whether this will be right or not. And you can do that by understanding and studying the stock market. It's not hard, pretty easy. There's just a few key stocks you watch out for. And again, it's all based on the earnings of land. And so once you see that, you can start to work out there's a few key things you can look for, earnings-based, that will tell you whether this is going to be right or not. And, the market doesn't collapse in a day. It might look like it, but it doesn't. It builds into a momentum, and then it'll, 2026 likely it'll go sideways at tops for quite some months. But you can work that out for yourself by just knowing what to look for, which again comes back to the earnings of land and the earnings of corporations and the earnings of corporations that deal in land. And so that's what I show people. So not only do you don't have to guess at this, the market is going to tell us what it's going to do next if you know how to read it. And that's what Akhil and I try and do for our subscribers, to allow them to teach themselves. So if I stop commentating at some point, they'll be able to work it out for themselves, right? And it just brings enormous relief, because you don't need to panic about every particular news day and the whole news cycle about what's going on.
You don't need to be doing this. You've been very generous with your time in terms of teaching other people from day one, trying to get the word out about the cycle and how it can help people, the corruption of economics and all this sort of stuff. For you personally, what are you looking forward to in the future? I heard that potentially you were writing another book, maybe on GAN. I was very excited to hear that. What's in the future for you?
Yeah, I've overdone it. I think I should have stopped already, really, but I do enjoy the interaction I get with people. been lucky enough to meet some really, interesting people, including yourself, where you just, can talk and chat various things. So I'm grateful for that, but I think I've overdone it now. So Akhil can do a lot of the things. I would like to, in fact, I will be writing a book about the citizens' dividend. That's sort of half done. I want to write a book called The 7 Cycles That Rule the World. We've started that. And most of all, two more things I'd like to do. I would like to write a book that expands on what Fred did. I'd like to write a book that shows the UK real estate cycles going back to 1600 and King Henry VIII, who actually started the whole enclosure business. As really England's first landlord that bring it all together. So I'd like to trace that history like I did with the US. But then I would like to put together what I've learned from Gann. Gann was a genius. I think he's probably the smartest man that ever lived. He proved what all the great religious teachers were saying, and Gann proved what the religious people were saying. Gann proved it, showed how it works in timeframes, which he applied to the market, but you can equally as well apply this to yourself. I would like to show that and do some justice to Gann, bring that to a wider market so that we get to understand a bit about what we've lost of all the ancient wisdom and the ancient knowledge. All that leads to the pyramids and a bit of planetary timing and various things, which again you can use to quite accurately forecast things. So that's why I think this needs to be brought out to the wider world. I'd like to put all that down on paper before I leave this body and pass into the next one. So we'll have to see. But I do think I've overdone it a bit, but on classes and stuff. So yeah, all that stuff's coming. Yes.
So do you have to shut yourself away for 6 months with no contact virtually with anyone in order to get a book written? I can't imagine how difficult it must be with all the people contacting you, emails and sort of. How do you switch off and actually concentrate on writing something?
Well, of late that's been a bit tough, but it's quite natural for me to be able to shut myself in a library for 6 months. I don't have any trouble with that. Basically, I think most people in crowds are absolutely stupid, and I never wanted any part of that in crowds, not individually, but in crowds. So it won't be hard for me to lock myself away a bit and get some of that written. I actually find that quite enjoyable. And I have to be a little bit quiet as well, and the library's quite good, or wherever it is where I'm doing stuff, because I do, it's sort of, I pull it down, right? It isn't my stuff. I pull it down. It just sort of comes to me from wherever it comes from. And I do think it is time for some of what Gann knew. It's time for that to come out because it will teach people a little bit about what we've forgotten. And I think it'll be needed, because I do think over the next decade, there's probably some grim stuff coming when all the cycles converge after 2027. So we'll have to see. So I am determined to give myself some time to be able to do that. That's just something I feel I have to do. But I miss the subscriber interaction. I've always enjoyed. So we'll see how it goes.
Fred Harrison's very bearish about what will happen after 2026. It feels difficult to ignore such a big name if he's so bearish. But you're not quite so bearish. Are we looking at a 1929 style depression, or are we looking at similar to 2007, or is it going to be something in between, or can we just not know that until it comes?
Well, we can't get a major crash until we've had, certainly in the United States, a big upward move, and we haven't had that big upward move yet. I think that's still to come. If we get that big upward move, then we'll get quite a mighty crash. It'll depend on which side you're on. So if you're experiencing the crash and you're heavily in debt, it's going to feel like a depression. But if you're on the other side of the market where you've been able to prepare for it, which my subscribers are now starting to be prepared, and I'm already prepared for it, it won't feel like a depression. It'll feel like there's just massive opportunities to be made. So this time it's really going to be important which side you're on. You're going to need to know a bit about markets and how to handle it, and you don't want to be caught by surprise this time. I do think, though, we'll need to watch out, because the debts are so high now, they'll never be repaid. And if we get a downturn that's deflationary. That makes the debts even harder to pay off. Governments and banks will have to invent something a bit new to tide us over. So it could be something like a digital currency or something that the government will control, and then they'll give you 500 of digital currency X to then go out and spend. But not everybody will get it if you're anti-government or if you're not friendly to the ruling party. There's chances you could get excluded, or they'll tell you can only spend it this way, whatever else. Could be in some dark times that way, which is why I think the citizen dividend is so important, because we can get rid of government. So I'm not that bearish, because it'll be like every other thing. The world's not going to collapse. Things move on. And let's say, people, you might want to remember this. Let's say we get a dollar declining. I don't think there'll be a dollar crash. I think there'll be a government crisis, but not a dollar crisis, because the government US debt's too much. The lower that the American dollar goes, the cheaper US real estate becomes. So there could be a time when the dollar, let's say it does go lower, and the Chinese come out with some sort of alternative currency, that would make, for me, for example, and for you, that would make American real estate really cheap. And people like me and people a lot more wealthy than us, they'd look at that and say, well, I think I'd better start buying. And the US government could then come out and say, well, we need the immigrants, we need them coming in, because we need them to buy houses, and we need to build more houses, and that's how you kick off the next cycle. So it'll be horses for courses, and governments will adjust their rhetoric. And if things really do go much slower, you could easily get a very well-known person coming out and say, well, I was wrong on immigration. They're not all criminals. Let's have some more, because the times and the system will demand it. Yes, so governments are reactionary. They don't create anything new themselves. And so that will eventually kick off the cycle, because it's just the earnings related. And if people have seen my clock, let's say we get a massive downturn, and then to move out of the downturn, eventually house prices stabilise. You then get the once the price of existing buildings stabilise a bit, and if they start going back up a little bit, it then becomes cheaper to build new housing. Then you get the developers in on the action. Before you know it, we've got a new cycle. So, if you've read my book, if you've seen my clock, you'll know how that works. And that we're into a new cycle. But it would not surprise me in the slightest that all the AI stuff that comes through, all the developments and the inventions and everything else that will spawn, just like the iPhone did after 2008. And then we had in 2010 the invention of Airbnb, which immediately, if you could rent out your house on Airbnb instead of on a yearly basis, on a daily basis, the extra earnings that you got for doing that immediately capitalised into higher land price. Kicks off the system, see? So there'll be another new invention, another new technology that happens that will kick off the system. So I'm not overly bearish. The world's not going to collapse, but it'll be very difficult times if you're in the wrong way. In other words, if you've got debts that you can't manage and you've got no way of paying off, you could easily be wiped out.
Ray Kurzweil wrote a book that I read in 2000 about technology and the effects of the singularity, where computers become as intelligent as human beings. It's called The Age of Spiritual Machines, but the idea was that we're going to hit a point where machines are going to be themselves spiritual. And I thought to myself, well, that gives us 20 years before that happens, so we'll be able to trade and make money in the markets, and I'll be able to still study them from a technical point of view. Raoul Powell, who has just put out a YouTube video saying that he thinks we're 6 years away from the end of anybody being able to make money, because it'll all be bots and AI. I'm kind of paraphrasing what he's saying there. And also that energy will become like water. It'll be just cheap, very, very cheap. So we could have a massive deflationary period coming ahead. The whole idea of having that predictive nature taken away from the markets, it's not something I would really relish at all.
Two things there. First up, cheap energy and all the free energy and everything else. If we've got a genuinely deflationary environment, government can't allow that to happen. They simply cannot. So they would have to do something about that. They'd have to do something new to create inflation. There's just no other way around it. Otherwise, the debts would be just utterly crippling. Now, of course, that might happen, and it might kill various governments. That's decidedly possible. I've got a theoretical, and it's more than theoretical. I've got a 18.6-year cycle mechanism that very much helps me determine what's going to happen next. But it's not a crystal ball as to what's going to happen on a daily basis. So anything is possible. As to predictive nature of markets, I've seen, Paul, I've seen this before. I read an article the other day that said they're going to use AI architecture to provide stability in markets. Well, I've seen that before. I deal with that in my book. There was other times throughout the cycles, years before, where they thought the new technology would come through that would help stabilize markets and would take away the volatility and everything else, and everything would just go to absolute stability.
Program trading, the 1980s,
whatever it was, can't happen, won't happen. And if you think that AI is going to come in and take away the predictive ability, I would vehemently disagree with that. In my opinion, it would make things even more violent. And AI would have to come out and say it's a land question. You need to understand the land, and you need to read Fred Harrison. Until AI comes out and says that, we're not got any worries about being able to forecast markets.
I know you're on a tight time schedule, so I'm going to make one last question. Jim Rogers, a well-renowned trader, he set up the Quantum Fund with George Soros. He sold his New York apartment, moved to Singapore. He says China's the future. But what is your opinion of the possible future of China overtaking America? Certainly, it doesn't look like that at this point in time. And America always looks more attractive than China for lots of reasons. One being that you can't buy land in China. You can only lease it in the same way as Singapore. But do you think that we're heading towards the end of an era for America, and like when the UK, when Britain ruled the waves and their empire then went down, is that possible for America, or do you still think it's got a bright future?
I'm not a supporter of that view. I think China was the future, no longer. There's never been an instance in history where a dictator has worked for their country. It doesn't happen because it doesn't allow the country to be creative. You know, you look at people at the moment, they vote with their feet. They'll always be voting with their feet. I don't see anybody trying to run or walk into Russia. I don't see them trying to get into North Korea. And I don't see anybody trying to get the border illegally into China. They all want to go to the US. Why? Because it's freedom, essentially. Yes, you've got to put up with a bit of stuff that happens in America from time to time, guns and everything else. But basically, the government doesn't worry about you too much in the US, and you can get your living. I also think, based on the way Gann would study history, when you look back at timeframes, and the people listening now, you can do this for yourself. You look back 20 years, you look back 60 years, and you look back 100 years, and you look back 144 years and 180 years. All those years in those timeframes going forward about a decade from those counts, certainly say from 60 years back. So we're talking 1966. From then, China had very difficult circumstances. So China's now going to see a 60-year repeat of that Cultural Revolution. So, it wouldn't take much if she died all of a sudden, or if there was some political turmoil. The country could easily just go nowhere for ages and ages. So I'm not in the camp that says China's going to rule, because dictators don't work. They don't provide freedom for people. And you can see it already where China, I think the number of IPOs that were done in China this year is down 90-something%. There's no originality coming out of China anymore. They've been caught stealing everybody else's technology. Not that they're smart people. They're just, and they want to do well for themselves. But the general populace, I don't think, is now on board like they used to be. So I think China's going to have some problems that they're going to have to deal with first. China may give a problem to the world. If I've got my demographics right, there's going to be about 40, 50, or even 60 million more men in China in the next decade than women. That'll present an issue. So anyway, we'll just have to see how it pans out. But I'm hesitant to suggest that China will be taking over, because it's just not what the general people would want, I think. And but anyway, it's hard to work out through all the propaganda. I'm not a China specialist, so I can, it's not my that's not my area of forecasting. I stick to the real estate cycle. I've been good at that in the past, as you know. So I try to stick to my area of interest. But I do think I would never sell short America, never. They're a very hardworking people, a hardworking nation, and they're inventive. And we've seen that the past several hundred years. I think there's no reason why that can't continue. But they've got a few troubles to go through first, probably, if the real estate cycle does turn down like it should on time.
So somebody who's listening to this, what would be their first step to getting more information from you? Should they go to the property Sharemarket Economics.com website, or what would be the first step?
Yeah, you can sign up to our blog, our weekly newsletter, propertysharemarketeconomics.com. That's free. I'd recommend that people do that because it's a wealth of information there. And then because it's free, you can then decide what you want to do with it. I'd also suggest you should read Akhil Patel's book. It's The Secret Wealth Advantage. It's been very well written, as you know. It's a very easy read for all the history and the cycles. I also think you should read Fred Harrison's book, The Power in the Land. And if you get a chance, Mason Gaffney and The Corruption of Economics, it's astounding. You know, you either your jaws drop or your eyes open up a bit, and then you can see the system, you can see through it, and you can start making forecasts for yourself.
If somebody's thinking about being a subscriber, can you tell us what they would get from subscribing to your service?
The ability to make astounding forecasts and improve their investment returns.
Phil Anderson, thank you so much for coming on the pod. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all the very best with all your endeavors with your books. And hopefully, once you're through the other side, we can interview you again, because I know you're not going to be doing very many.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Paul.